The night Ramona Ihek found out about her husband and her sister, she was wearing the dress she'd bought specifically to celebrate two things at once. The Westbrook Cultural Center had taken Alec 4 years. 4 years of late nights and rolled blueprints on the kitchen table and phone calls that ended conversations before they started. Ramona had given those years willingly, because she understood obsession. She was a cardiac surgeon who regularly held other people's hearts in her gloved hands. She understood what it meant to pour yourself into something until it poured back. That November evening, the center's glass atrium blazed with light. 400 guests moved through the space in cocktail attire. Champagne in hand, necks craned upward at the cedar lattice ceiling that Alec had agonized over for 7 months. The Vancouver skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows on the south wall. Somewhere behind the crowd a string quartet played something Ramona didn't recognize but found beautiful. She'd received the call from the chief of medicine that same morning, 8 hours before this gala, confirming what she'd suspected but hadn't dared want too badly. She was the new department head of cardiac surgery at Vancouver General Hospital, the first black woman to hold that position in the hospital's history. Her hands had actually trembled when she'd hung up the phone. She'd sat in her car in the hospital parking structure for 4 full minutes before she could drive. She hadn't told Alec yet. She'd planned to tell him tonight, after the crowd thinned and the champagne was gone, and they could sit together on the drive home, and she could watch his face when he heard. She was wearing a dress the color of dark wine, something she'd bought 6 weeks ago on impulse and kept hanging in the back of the closet for the right moment. This was the right moment. She felt it in the way the evening settled around her like something earned. Music. Mrs. Grantley, this space is extraordinary. A city councilor whose name she couldn't immediately recall reached out to shake her hand. Your husband has outdone himself. He really has, Ramona said, and she meant it. She moved through the room accepting greetings, exchanging cards, pausing at the bar for sparkling water. Alec had texted an hour ago to say he was caught in a debrief with the project team but would find her inside. She wasn't worried, she was proud. She wanted to find him and stand beneath this ceiling he'd imagined into existence and feel the particular satisfaction of two people who had built separate things and still built them together. She was making her way toward the far end of the atrium when she noticed the glass-walled meeting room that jutted off the main hall like a viewing box. The lights inside were dimmed but not off. Through the translucent etched glass, she could make out 2 figures, shapes more than details at first, the way you register movement before meaning. Then she stopped. The etched glass wasn't opaque enough, not in that light, not with the full atrium glowing behind her. Alec's height was unmistakable. She'd watched him move through rooms for 11 years. She knew the slope of his shoulders, the way he tilted his head when he was being tender with someone, and the woman he had both arms around. The woman pressed into his chest with her face turned up toward his, her fingers curled into the lapel of his jacket. Ramona knew the back of that head even better. She'd been braiding that hair since its owner was 4 years old. Music. Penny. Ramona's hands went cold around the stem of her water glass. She stood still for what might have been 3 seconds or 30. The room continued around her. Conversation, laughter, the quartet, the clink of glass. Nobody was looking at her. Nobody saw the thing she was seeing. She watched her husband touch the side of her sister's face with something that wasn't new, something settled. She watched Penny lean into it the way a person leans into the familiar. Not stolen, expected. Ramona turned and walked back into the crowd. Music. She found Greta Holst, her anesthesiologist, her closest friend at the hospital, the person who'd sat with her through every difficult shift and every difficult year, near the canapé table. Ramona said very quietly, "I need a minute," and Greta looked at her face and said, "We're getting your coat." They stood outside on the front steps in the November air while Ramona said what she'd seen. Her voice stayed level. Her hands had stopped shaking by then, replaced by something colder and more precise. Greta listened without interrupting. When Ramona finished, Greta was quiet for a moment. "You don't do anything tonight." "I know," Ramona said. "You go back in, you stand beside him, you smile, and tomorrow you call a lawyer." "I know," Ramona said again. She went back inside. Alec found her 20 minutes later, flushed with the success of the evening, his tie loosened, scanning for her through the crowd. When he spotted her, his face opened into something that looked genuinely happy to see her, and she thought, 11 years of that face, 11 years of believing it. He kissed her cheek. His cologne was the same one she'd bought him for their anniversary 3 years ago. "There you are." He took her hand. "What do you think? Tell me everything." It's stunning, she said. You should be so proud. Music. She stayed 2 more hours. She made conversation and laughed at things that were actually funny and watched Penny across the room pretend to be a stranger's acquaintance. Penny caught her eye once. She smiled and lifted her glass. Penny smiled back and Ramona thought, there it is. There's the thing she's been hiding at every Sunday dinner, every Christmas, every time she sat at Ramona's kitchen table and accepted tea and looked her in the eye. In the car going home, Alec reached across the console and covered her hand with his. I don't think I've ever been happier than I was tonight, he said. I know exactly what you are, Ramona said. He laughed. He thought she was paying him a compliment. Music. She didn't sleep. She lay beside him in the dark and listened to him breathe and thought about everything she needed to do in the right order. In the morning she called Tony Ferris, a paralegal friend from university who'd spent a decade in family law, and asked for the name of the best divorce lawyer in Vancouver. Tony didn't ask why. She texted a name within the hour. Senior partner, high asset cases, known for winning cleanly and moving precisely. Music. Ramona sat across from Ifeoma 3 days later in a corner office overlooking False Creek. Ifeoma was composed and unhurried, with a stillness about her that Ramona recognized as the kind built from years of sitting across from people in the worst moments of their lives. Walk me through what you have, Ifeoma said. Ramona walked her through it, the gala, what she'd seen through the glass, the 11 years, the specific fact of her sister. Ifeoma listened without expression. Then she said, do you have your marriage contract? Ramona produced it from her bag. She'd gone to the safety deposit box at the bank that morning alone while Alec was at his office. They'd signed the contract before the wedding at Ramona's insistence. She had her grandmother's house in Saskatoon, which she'd inherited and sold and used to buy their home in East Vancouver. That property was hers, premarital, documented under her name alone. Alec had agreed to the contract readily, the way people agree to things they believe will never matter. Ifeoma read through it page by page. Ramona watched her expression settle. Your infidelity clause is comprehensive, Ifeoma said. If your husband commits adultery, you retain the matrimonial home, which is already yours outright as premarital property, and you receive 65% of all jointly held assets acquired during the marriage. His business equity, investments, everything you built together. His family's lawyer drafted it, Ramona said. They wrote it to protect against you, Ifeoma said. They assumed that if anyone broke the marriage it would be you. The penalty was meant to be a deterrent. Ramona absorbed this without comment. Do you have evidence beyond what you witnessed? I'm working on that. Music. She worked on it for 9 days. She was systematic about it the way she was systematic about everything, methodically, without urgency, without letting emotion make her sloppy. She'd spent 15 years making decisions under pressure with someone's life in her hands. 9 days of careful investigation was not difficult. The bank records came first. She had full access to their joint account. Alec had always insisted on that, called it transparency, called it trust. Going back through 28 months of statements, she found a recurring transfer. $1,800 on the first of every month to an account number she didn't recognize. No label, no pay name, as consistent as a bill. Because that's what it was. She traced the account through the bank manager she'd treated with ordinary courtesy over the years, the kind of relationship built slowly and turned useful in unexpected ways. The account belonged to a numbered company incorporated in BC. The company listed a single director, Alec Grantley. The company held the lease on a 1-bedroom condo in Yaletown. Music. She drove past it on a Tuesday afternoon between surgeries. A clean building on a quiet block, the kind where you could live invisibly if you chose to. She didn't go in. She took a photograph of the address and the nameplate by the entrance and drove back to the hospital. That evening she found the jewelry receipt. She'd been looking for their car insurance documents in Alec's home office and found a folded paper in the breast pocket of a jacket hanging on the back of his chair. A gold bracelet from a shop on Robson Street, engraved. The initials P.I. Penny Ihek. Ramona had bought Penny a bracelet with the same initials for her 25th birthday. She remembered wrapping it at the kitchen table while Alec sat across from her reading the paper. She remembered him looking up and saying, "That's nice. She'll love it." She'd bought a bracelet for her sister, so had her husband. Different occasions. Same person, same initials, as if even in generosity they had been running parallel without her knowing. She photographed the receipt and replaced the jacket exactly as she'd found it. Music. She met with Ifeoma again 2 days later. Bank records, the numbered company registration, the lease, the receipt. Ifeoma reviewed everything with her glasses on, then looked up. This establishes financial misconduct in addition to adultery, she said. He's been using joint funds to maintain his relationship with your sister. 28 months. Just over $54,000. A pause. That's not a footnote. That matters significantly. I want to file at the end of the week, Ramona said. Then continue behaving normally until then. I can do that. Music. The last ordinary days had a texture she hadn't expected. She made coffee. She went to the hospital and held other people's hearts and made decisions that kept them alive. She came home and asked Alec how his day had been and listened to him answer and offered the right responses. The performance of normalcy was seamless enough that it almost frightened her. Not because she'd become cold, but because she'd become focused. And focus had always been her sharpest tool. The hardest evening was dinner with Penny. Penny had texted suggesting it, their usual monthly dinner, Vietnamese on Commercial Drive. Ramona said yes without hesitating. She sat across from her sister in the booth they'd eaten in 100 times and watched her order the lemongrass chicken and pour Ramona's tea, and talk about her job and her apartment, and her plans for the holidays. Penny was easy, relaxed. She laughed at her own jokes the way she always had. Nothing in her manner suggested she was doing anything other than having dinner with her sister. At one point Penny said, Alec seemed so happy at the opening. Like that project really let something loose in him. He's been different lately, lighter. I've noticed, Ramona said. Penny wrapped both hands around her tea. You two are solid, you always have been, you know that, right? Ramona looked at her across the table. Her little sister. The one she'd helped move into her first apartment. The one she'd sat beside in the hospital when their father had his bypass surgery. The one who knew every important thing about her life because she had been, Ramona had always believed, the one person who would never need to be guarded against. I know exactly what we are, Ramona said. Penny nodded and reached for a spring roll, and the moment moved past. Music. The night before filing, Alec came home with flowers, yellow tulips which he knew she preferred. He set them in the blue vase on the counter, poured himself a glass of wine, and sat at the kitchen island looking at her with an expression she'd spent 11 years believing was love. I've been thinking, he said. After this project I want to be more present. I've pushed too much aside. That sounds good, she said. I mean it, Ramona. You're the most important thing in my life. I don't say it enough. She looked at him across the counter, at his familiar face, at the man who had sat in this kitchen while she wrapped a birthday gift for her sister and said nothing, who had kept a condo in Yaletown and a numbered company, and a bracelet with her sister's initials and come home every evening and asked how her day had been. You should have said it more, she told him. He thought she was gently agreeing with him. He reached over and covered her hand with his. I'm the luckiest man alive, he said. I know, she said. Good night, Alec. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time before she could sleep. Music. The process server reached Alec's office at 11:15 the following morning, 20 minutes after his weekly staff meeting ended. Ramona knew the timing because Ifeoma had coordinated it precisely, maximum clarity, minimum time for damage control. Her phone began ringing at 11:42. She was between surgeries, standing in the scrub room. She looked at the screen, watched his name light up and set the phone face down on the counter. It rang again, and again. She counted 16 calls before she left the hospital that afternoon. The texts arrived in waves, first confused, what is this, call me, there has to be an explanation, then more measured, more deliberate. Ramona, this is not what you think, please, we need to talk then at 5 o'clock. I love you. Whatever I've done, I love you, please don't do this. She read each one, she deleted each one. Music. Penny called at 6:30. Ramona watched the name on her screen and let it ring out. A text arrived 3 minutes later. He said it wasn't what it looked like, that you'd both had problems for years. Ramona, please. I don't know what's happening. Ramona read it twice. She thought about the spring rolls and the tea. She thought about Penny's hands wrapped around the cup, her voice saying you two are solid, her face open and easy. She thought about how long it must have taken to learn to sit across a table from someone and lie that completely. She blocked the number. Music. The legal proceedings moved with the steadiness of something well prepared. Ifeoma was precise and unrelenting in negotiations. Alec's lawyer, a senior partner named Winston Kite who came with a significant reputation, tried several angles. He argued the numbered company was a legitimate investment vehicle with no proven personal connection. He argued that what Ramona had observed at the gala was a moment of friendship misread through imperfect glass. He argued that the marriage contract, signed under the implicit pressure of protecting premarital assets, deserved fresh consideration. IFEMA dismantled each position methodically. The bank records established a consistent financial pattern that no legitimate business investment required. The property manager of the Yaletown building confirmed the lease arrangements. A former bookkeeper for the numbered company, reached through a private investigator IFEMA had retained, confirmed that expenses associated with the condo appeared regularly in company accounts categorized as client entertainment. Winston Kite got quieter with each exchange. The house stayed Ramona's. It had always been hers, her grandmother's money, her name alone on the title. Alec had never managed to shift it to joint ownership, though Ramona had found drafted paperwork in his files during the investigation showing he'd intended to ask. He'd never gotten around to it. Perhaps on some level he'd suspected she would refuse. The joint investment accounts, nearly $400,000 accumulated over a decade, split at 65% in Ramona's favor under the marriage contract terms. The $54,000 that had moved from their joint account to the Yaletown condo was classified as matrimonial waste and factored into the settlement accordingly. Alec walked away with less than a third of what they'd built. His pride would cost him longer. Music. Her mother called 6 weeks after the filing. She'd heard through family the way these things travel. "Tell me it's not true," she said, "about Penny." "It's true," Ramona said. The silence that followed was the kind that holds everything at once. "She called me," she cried, for an hour. "She said she didn't know it would go this far." Ramona thought about that phrase, "didn't know it would go this far," as though the problem were scale rather than fact, as though 2.5 years of deliberate concealment were just a matter of degree. "I'm not asking you to choose," Ramona said carefully. "She's your daughter. I know you'll find a way to love you both." "I'm choosing," her mother said. "I want you to know that." Ramona closed her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. Music. Penny sent a message 4 months later, relayed through their cousin who'd been recruited as an intermediary. 5 paragraphs. Ramona read the whole thing. About how Alec had told Penny the marriage was hollow, how he'd made everything sound inevitable, how she'd believed him in the beginning, because he'd been so careful and so convincing and so determined to make her feel that what they were doing wasn't what it was. Ramona sat with the message for a while. She didn't doubt that Alec had been persuasive. She knew what he was capable of. But Penny had been 27 when this started. Old enough to know what a marriage meant. Old enough to have picked up the phone and called her sister. She'd made the same choice every Tuesday and Thursday dinner, every holiday, every time she'd sat at Ramona's kitchen table and said nothing. People are responsible for the choices they keep making, not just the first one. Ramona understood forgiveness as a concept. She also understood that it was something you did for yourself, not the other person. She didn't need to offer Penny anything to be free of this. She closed the message without responding. Music. Spring came to East Vancouver the way it always does, suddenly and without apology. The cherry trees on her street flowered overnight. She could see them from the kitchen window at 7 in the morning while the coffee brewed, pink against the blue mountains across the inlet. She'd been formally named department head in January. The ceremony was small. The chief of medicine, a few colleagues, a framed letter, a new nameplate for her office door. She'd called her mother afterward. She hadn't called anyone else, and that felt right. Her days had found a different shape, longer mornings, actual evenings, not just the hours left after everything else. She'd started running again along the seawall, something she'd let go in residency and never come back to. She'd repainted the living room a shade of green she'd been thinking about for 3 years. She'd filled 2 bookshelves in a room that had previously held Alec's architectural models, a use of the space that suited her considerably better. The house felt different with only her in it. Not lonely. That was the thing she'd expected and hadn't quite found. It felt like a held breath finally released, like the rooms had expanded by some measurement that had nothing to do with square footage. Music. In June she established a scholarship in her grandmother's name, the Eunice Ihek Award for Women in Cardiovascular Medicine, offered annually to a black female medical student at a Canadian university. She funded it through a portion of the divorce settlement. It felt like the right use of that money. Her grandmother had sold a small house in Saskatoon, and that sale had eventually become this house and this career and this particular morning, and completing that circle felt necessary in a way she couldn't fully articulate and didn't need to. She mentioned it at a hospital gala in October when someone asked what she was working on. The room was warm and unremarkable and nothing like the Westbrook atrium. She wore blue this time. She stood alone in the room and was not lonely. Music. On a Thursday evening in early November, almost exactly a year after the night in the atrium, Ramona sat in the garden behind her house with a glass of sparkling water and watched the light move across the North Shore mountains. The colors shifted through amber into something deeper before the sky took them entirely. Her phone showed a news alert. Alec Grantley's firm had lost a major public contract in Surrey, citing a dispute with a former partner that had surfaced during the city's due diligence review. She read 3 sentences and closed the notification. He was a chapter she'd closed, his outcomes were his to carry. Music. She set the phone on the patio table and looked at the mountains. A year ago she'd stood in a glass atrium in a wine-colored dress, believing she'd arrived somewhere, and she had, just not where she'd thought. The arrival she'd actually been walking toward had been longer and less comfortable and more entirely her own than anything she could have arranged. There was nothing tidy about it, nothing that would look graceful from the outside. It was just the shape her life had taken when she'd stopped letting someone else's choices define its edges. She was 36 years old. She was department head of cardiac surgery. She ran 7 kilometers 3 mornings a week. She had a garden she was slowly learning to care for and a house that asked nothing of her except presence. The first recipient of her grandmother's scholarship had just been named. A third-year student at the University of Alberta, the daughter of Cameroonian immigrants, who had written in her application about the cardiac ward, where her mother had worked as an aide, and how she'd spent her childhood watching surgeons, and deciding that one day she would be one. Ramona had read that application twice. It stayed with her in the particular way that things stay with you when they feel like proof of something. Music. The mountains had gone dark by the time she went inside. She locked the back door, rinsed her glass, set her coffee mug out for morning, stood for a moment in the quiet kitchen. She'd thought, the night she saw them through the etched glass, that finding out was the worst thing that could happen to her. She'd stood in the cold November air on those front steps, and felt the whole shape of her life shift, and she'd thought, this is the damage, this is where everything comes apart. But damage, she'd learned, was not the same as ending. She was a cardiac surgeon. She knew better than most people what the heart could sustain. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and outside the cherry trees were bare now, and in 5 months they would flower again. And that too was exactly what she expected.